everyone. Thank you for staying so late. I hope I'll entertain you for another couple of minutes. I'm from the university, Mickiewicz University in Poznań, but for the past year and a half I completed a research project at the University of Bologna, and this is the project that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to tell you how we use language when we juggle more than one. And I guess for this particular audience, distinctive cases of language use that I'm going to talk about today are very familiar. So you frequently heard people speaking other languages, non-native languages. Then you frequently used a foreign language. You probably also participated in conferences when you heard simultaneous interpretation, and you could spot that probably interpreters use language slightly differently. The least thing that you can notice is that intonation is different. And then quite frequently, I guess, you would read a text and you look at the text and you see that a formulation might not be exactly perfect. And it might not sound quite so natural. So these are those distinctive cases of language use that I'm going to talk about today. They stem from bilingual communication when we have to process two languages to produce our communicate. And well, there is a question, do we all speak the same language? Well, in theory, we have a similar word repertoire at our disposal. We are all using the same words, hypothetically, and we are trying to use them to adhere the same conventions to make ourselves understandable. But the way we use language is conditioned by a number of different factors. And in fact, language use is context dependent, but we also use language differently when we speak and when we write. And we have certain personal favorites, so we like some words more than others do, and when you compare yourself to another speaker, probably there are differences. To such an extent that there is a lot of individual variation in how language is used. And this is because we are all exposed to slightly different linguistic experience. So we have heard different people talk about different things. We lived in different countries, etc., etc. And now even we can today treat language as kind of linguistic universal fingerprint. So it's still possible today to differentiate speakers based on how they use language, and I guess orthography might just well be one of the key factors in that as well. So what our previous speaker was talking about. But there are also universal patterns, and I'm particularly interested in these. So you use language across different registers. For instance, the spoken versus written register is completely different. Then genres, when you read science fiction novel, it reads completely differently than the paper that you regularly produce. And then native versus non-native communication, and translated versus non-translated texts, and interpreted versus non-interpreted texts. So these are the focal point of my research, and in particular, I'm looking at how native speakers of Polish use English language when speaking it as a foreign language, when interpreting from Polish into English, and when translating from Polish into English. And the difference between interpretation and translation, just to be clear, is that the interpretation is oral and translation is written. Now, non-native communication and translations and interpretations have, it seems, a lot in common. They have certain universal constraints, or in other words, limitations. So when you have to use two languages to communicate, this communicative situation is, these factors are very similar. What is different, though, is that when you speak a language as a foreigner, you still have a lot of freedom regarding how you put your thoughts. So it's an independent text production. And when you are translating, when you are interpreting, you have a source text that you have to rely on. Still, both these situations are bilingual, and that's what links them. And now I'm investigating universals, so kind of general patterns in constrained communication, and this hypothesis entails that translation and bilingual communication involves the use of two languages, and that's why we can account for, this fact may account for similar phenomena appearing in both types of communication. And there have been different studies on that before, but they only were limited to the written register. So for instance, the use of a very small word, therefore, has been investigated, and it turns out that both non-natives and translators use it in a similar way. Then reported speech constructions like I said that or I thought that are also used in a slightly different way when it's used by non-natives or translators. And also texts that are non-native or translated have typically lower lexical richness, which means that the range of vocabulary used in these texts is slightly narrower compared to native speakers' text. And they use idiomatic expressions in a slightly different way. They also use more pronouns and more cohesive devices. But that was only limited to written register. And now my project was to take all those forms of communication together and compare them, and to see whether there are any differences also between spoken and written register. So my project was called TRINFO, from features of TRanslationese, INterpretese, and Foreignese. And the aim was to test this constrained communication hypothesis that I just introduced, but on a very homogeneous data set. And the European Parliament is like a perfect data set for that, because professionals communicate both in a foreign language, in a native language, and they are interpreted simultaneously, and these texts are also translated. So this is like a perfect linguistic laboratory, if you want. And just to make clear what I compared native MEPs, native English MEPs speaking English to Polish MEPs speaking English, and then to interpretations and translations from Polish to English. And I compared both the spoken language and the written language. The way speeches the way the European Parliament works is that an MEP first delivers a speech, and they are at the same time simultaneously interpreted. And then after the plenary is closed, a verbatim report is made of each speech, and then these are translated. So it's a unique opportunity to look at interpretations and translations of the same text. And I'm using a corpus linguistics method, and that means that I take all the texts that I gathered for my analysis and look for regularities in them. So I analyze them automatically, and I'm looking into patterns that distinguish one language variety from another. And what I found out is that constrained varieties, that is non-native speech and translations and interpretations, do use cohesive devices differently than native speakers. But the trends are not exactly the same. They favor different types of cohesive devices. And so, for instance, people who use English as a non-native tongue, so Polish speakers of English, if you will, are keen on using phrase-level communicators a lot, like and but. These are very nice small words that also buy you more thinking time, so it's a very neat device. And interpreters and translators like to use additive sentence transitions like moreover and in addition, etc., to link the ideas between the sentences even more. And interpreters also use more pronouns like this and that. And interpreters, what's interesting, add more connectives to the target text than the translators do. So when you compare the source text, the original text, and the translations and the interpretations of the same text, it turns out that there are many more connectives in what has been interpreted, and those connectives were not originally there in the source text. Also, as I mentioned before, the range of vocabulary that is used when people interpret and when they translate and when they use language as a non-native tongue is much narrower, and this has been confirmed. And it's confirmed both on the spoken register, so when we speak and when we write. And also an additional feature that we investigated, formality. It turns out that when we use language as non-natives, we tend to be more formal. And this also pertains to interpreters and translators, and it's also, it regards completely different source and target languages. So I also worked with other colleagues from the University of Bologna and Turku, and it turns out that it's not only the Polish non-native speakers and translators and interpreters who do that. And now the impact and applications of my work. Well, it's mostly empirical, so it highlights the differences between the investigated varieties and can be later on investigated further in an experimental setting to get to know why exactly that happens. But also it can be applied to foreign language teaching and translator and interpreter training. And it can also be used to fine-tune natural language processing tools like plagiarism detection or language modeling and machine translation. And on this very practical level, what this means, it means that when we are using a language as foreigners and when you are using language when we translate or when we interpret, it's true that maybe this language is simplified and it is more formal and we use more cohesive devices. And thus it might sound slightly less natural, but on the other hand, all these features contribute to how effective a message is and how easy to understand it is. So it is, in fact, slightly more, well, it can help us achieve our communicative goals better. Thank you very much.